Welcome back everybody, my name is Tucker, and today's video is the return of a series that's been on my channel for a while, but I don't do all that often just because they are huge undertakings to go through and look at all this stuff, and it's NBA Trade Rewind. So basically what this is I look back at big trades throughout NBA history and talk about how they impacted the league, but also where all the pieces ended up over the last couple of years and now how they affect the modern NBA in 2020. And today's video is a long time coming. This is a trade that I probably should have covered in this series at one point in the past, and it is the Nets, Paul Pierce, Kevin Garnett trade that I've talked about in previous videos, but I've never done a trade rewind on them, and so I'm excited to go ahead and share this with you guys. But really quickly before we get started, if you enjoy the NBA, then consider subscribing. I upload every single day. Okay, so this is about as actually scripted as my videos get nowadays on this channel, so forgive me if I'm looking over at my laptop a little bit here because there is a lot of information to go through. So really quickly how this works in terms of an outline of what we're going to be going through here. I'm going to look at the initial trade, talk about what each team was trying to get out of the deal at the time that it was made. Then I'm going to talk about what each piece did for the team initially if they ended up playing. Then I'm going to talk about what the piece turned into down the road if they turned into anything. And then I'm going to talk about what it means in the NBA in 2020, where all these different trade assets and pieces ended up and how they're currently affecting, in this case, the Nets and the Celtics. Okay, so let's look at the initial terms of the trade back on July 12th, 2013. The Nets received Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce, Jayson, DJ White, and what was eventually a 2017 first-round pick that became Kyle Kuzma, and a 2017 second-round pick that became an international player whose name I'm not going to attempt to pronounce. While the Celtics received Keith Bogans, Marshawn Brooks, Chris Humphries, Chris Wallace, Gerald Wallace, an eventual 2014, 2016, 2017, and 2018 first-round pick, with the first-round pick in 2018 being a pick swap, and each of those players became James Young, Jaylen Brown, Markelle Fultz, and Colin Sexton, respectively, in terms of the actual pick that was made. Okay, so let's talk about this trade in terms of what the point of it was at the time. For the Nets, they wanted to put a quote-unquote super team on the floor. They were committed to being a championship contender as they were now moving the team to Brooklyn. They had Darren Williams, they had Joe Johnson, they had Brook Lopez. They wanted to bring in other pieces around those guys that made them a legit championship contender. And ownership was really pushing for a big move. They didn't care about future pieces. They didn't care about anything but being a really good team and being a championship contending team in Brooklyn. And so they made this move to be the biggest win now move probably in the history of the league. They wanted Kevin Garnett, they wanted Paul Pierce, they wanted championship proven guys, they wanted to bring in Jayson as well as a role player, and they didn't care how many future assets they gave up, because if they won a championship, then it wouldn't have mattered, right? And ownership was pushing for it, and that's why the price tag got as high as it did. And Kevin Garnett and Paul Pierce still certainly had trade value at this point. It's not like they were complete scrubs, it's just that the Nets wanted these guys so badly that the price tag got pushed up significantly as trade talks went on. And even as bad as it looks in hindsight, and we'll get to that later, at the time, it did make at least a little bit of sense, because you didn't think that the picks were going to be as good as they ended up being down the road and turn into the players that they ended up turning into. And going into the following season, on paper, the Nets were a legit top 5 team in the entire league with Joe Johnson, Darren Williams, Brook Lopez, Kevin Garnett, and Paul Pierce. That lineup, plus the guys they had coming off the bench, looked like a legit problem going into that season. Then for the Celtics, it's pretty simple. They had some aging players in Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett that they wanted to move, right? They wanted to move on from the previous era. They're going to eventually trade Rajon Rondo in this as well. And they want to get future picks. They want to get assets. They want to rebuild in a sense. They want to bring in Brad Stevens. They want to just start a whole new era of Celtics basketball. And they knew that this was pretty much the last time that guys like Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett were going to have a good amount of value around the league. And even though it was a tough move to make at the time because of what both of those players meant to the team and meant to the franchise, it turned out obviously to be a very good move, and they got a ton of value out of these players. Okay, so now let's talk about what each of these pieces ended up becoming down the road. Not necessarily what they are for these teams right now, but just where each piece went around the league afterwards. So Kevin Garnett was traded in 2015 to the Timberwolves in exchange for Thaddeus Young, and then Young was traded in 2016 for a first-round pick that ended up becoming Karis LeVert for Brooklyn now. Paul Pierce left the Nets as a free agent in 2014. Jayson was traded in 2014 with Reggie Evans to the Kings for Marcus Thornton, who was later traded for players that were waived. So that's irrelevant. DJ White was also waived. And here's where it gets interesting for the Nets. that eventual 2017 first-round pick did become Kyle Kuzma, which I mentioned earlier, and that pick was traded in 2017 along with Brook Lopez in exchange for D'Angelo Russell and Timofey Mozgov, and Russell obviously became a hugely significant piece in the rebuild that the Nets eventually undertook, and then the 2017 second-round pick guy that I talked about earlier has made no impact in the league at all. Meanwhile, for the Celtics, the first handful of guys are pretty much irrelevant. Bogans, Brooks, Humphries, Joseph, and Wallace are all pretty much irrelevant in this. Wallace was later traded along with Chris Babb for David Lee, who was also waived. So the interesting thing is the first round picks, obviously, right? So the 2014 first round pick became James Young, who ended up being a career G League guy, even though was a promising player initially, never really became anything. But of course, the 2016 first round pick became Jaylen Brown, who's still on the team as a borderline all-star caliber player. The eventual 2017 first-round pick became Markelle Fultz, who they traded for Jayson Tatum and a 2019 first that has now become Romeo Langford, both of which are still on the team. An eventual 2018 first-round pick swap became Colin Sexton, who was traded as a pick in 2017, along with Isaiah Thomas, Jay Crowder, Ante Zizic, and a 2020 second-round pick to Cleveland for Kyrie Irving, who also, of course, left in free agency this past offseason. And so this obviously changed basically everything for both of these teams. The Nets lost basically all of their future assets for the next handful of seasons that ended up becoming super valuable because they were either too old, too injured, or just not good enough, while the Celtics got multiple borderline all-star caliber players in Brown and Tatum is looking like a guy now, as I just mentioned in a video, that could be a future All-NBA caliber player. And then, of course, the pick that ended up becoming Colin Sexton as well that they traded in the Irving deal, but they could have just kept that and used it on a different player. The James Young pick could have worked out, like as well as this worked out for the Celtics, getting Tatum and Brown, and that is the core of what they're going to be moving forward as those two guys. That could have been even worse for the Nets and even better for the Celtics, given everything else that's involved in this trade, with having Romeo Langford involved now, and he could end up being a good player, and then the Colin Sexton pick that they got no value out of essentially because Kyrie left, and then the James Young pick in 2014 as well. Now, to be fair, the Nets did save themselves a little bit because they used that Kuzma pick to get D'Angelo Russell, which again we'll talk about a little bit later down the road, and then they swapped Garnett for essentially Caris LeVert straight up, but still, it's an awful trade for the Nets. Which brings us now to what these pieces look like in 2020. How is this currently impacting the league? What does the 2020 version of this trade look like? Well, the Nets received Caris LeVert and a piece in the D'Angelo Russell trade, who was later technically traded for Kevin Durant, and the Celtics received Jaylen Brown, Jayson Tatum, and Romeo Langford. And it's crazy to think about how both Tatum and Irving are involved here, and both of them ended up in Brooklyn this past offseason, but both of them were initially involved in this trade or were involved in it later down the road, right? Like you have the Sexton pick that was traded for Kyrie Irving. The Celtics probably don't get that deal done without that pick. That was kind of the sticking point, whether they were willing to give up that pick or not. They obviously had other assets, but I think that was the thing that Cleveland really wanted out of the deal as a potential replacement for Irving in the draft. And then in a really weird and roundabout way, the Nets kind of ended up getting Kevin Durant out of this. Now, they could have just outright signed him, right? Like, the only reason he's involved in this is because D'Angelo Russell was signed and traded to the Warriors in exchange for Durant, and they could have just straight up signed him because he decided to go to Brooklyn, and the D'Lo sign and trade thing just kind of came out at the end of the situation, right? But if you want to get technical, the Kuzma first-round pick, along with Lopez, got them Mozgov's big salary and D'Angelo Russell, and then later down the road, D'Angelo Russell was traded for Kevin Durant. I'm not officially including Durant in the 2020 version of this trade, but it's still at least interesting that Durant and Irving are involved here, as well as the fact that technically you could put him in there if you wanted to. And it's just crazy to think about, because if the Nets had never made this deal, they would have at least one good young player, right? Like, there's no way to know exactly what would have happened with those teams if they didn't have KG and Pierce on the roster, but they still weren't going to be great, right? Like, D-Will still was going to end up breaking down physically. Lopez was still going to get hurt. They're still going to have some bad records in the same seasons that they had bad records. They're certainly not going to be any better. So they could have ended up, it's not necessarily true that they would absolutely get Jayson Tatum. They would absolutely get Jaylen Brown, or that even if they did pick them, they'd end up being as good as they are now, given the difference in the developmental situations of Boston and Brooklyn. But they definitely lost out on an opportunity to get at least one really good young player. And then on the flip side, maybe they don't get LeVert because they don't have Garnett to flip for Young, to flip for the first-round pick, whatever it may be. And then this instigated a complete overhaul by the Nets in terms of their organization. They got rid of Billy King, who was the GM at the time of this deal, and the majority owner is now the minority owner. They're owned by someone completely different than the guy that initially pushed for this trade at the time. And in a weird way, it's kind of instigated this complete turnaround as a franchise for the Nets that allowed them to then get Kyrie and Kevin Durant. If this deal never happens, I'm not sure that Sean Marks is the GM as quickly as he was, and that Kenny Atkinson becomes the coach as quickly as he did, and they went over this complete rebuild and overhaul out of necessity because they were that bad. I'm not sure that they do. So it's kind of interesting how that now affects the league. And of course, for the Celtics, their entire future basically is built around what they got back in this trade. And it's not just Brown and Tatum, but Langford looks like he could be a good young player or a nice trade piece down the road. So this is one of the reasons I obviously wanted to cover it in this video. A wildly impactful trade on the current NBA with two of the more interesting teams in the league, I think, right now. The Celtics and the Nets. And there you have it. That is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. If you have any other trades you would like to see me do in this series, then be sure to leave those down in the comment section below, and I will absolutely check them out. But as I said in the beginning, my name is Tucker. I thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you all next time.